He bought an old barn for just 50 cents, and everyone laughed. But when the fire came, something burst from the ground that changed the fate of an entire town. This is a story of courage, faith, and justice. Watch till the end to see how it all unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The auction bell clanged like a cracked church tongue, scattering the dust-thick quiet of the town square into nervous laughter and boot scrapes. Men in good vests and better hats leaned against wagon wheels and porch rails, the way men do when they are certain the day will go their way. It had, so far. A string of lots had changed hands with the easy efficiency of a cattle drive fencing wire, a pair of decent mules, a wagon with one wheel that wobbled but did not complain. Then came the Henderson place, subdivided until none of it looked like a life someone once built. What remained at the end, after the plow, the tools, the chairs, was the barn. Widow Henderson had stared at the ground while the crier sang out the starting price. No one bid. Not at $1. Not at 75 cents. The barn tilted like a weary giant, plank ends giving the look of broken teeth, and the crowd's silence grew smug. 50 cents, Everett Kane said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, not with his last 2 quarters warming a palm calloused by work that rarely paid cash. But the number came anyway, a small sound in a big air. Heads turned. The crier blinked. On the porch of the bank, Sterling Maddox's smile opened slow as a knife. Sold, the crier decided, half to end the embarrassment, half because no one else seemed inclined to waste breath. His hammer popped the air. The laugh that followed belonged to the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, and everyone who wanted to be him. Everett endured it the way you endure noon sun, with the stiff, helpless dignity of someone who knows there's shade somewhere and intends to find it. When the papers were signed, one name written small, another witnessed with a flourish. Everett took the rusty key as if it weighed something a man could measure honor by. He tucked his receipt into the inside pocket of a jacket that had seen better owners and stepped off the boardwalk, careful to keep his face unreadable. You did not show men like Sterling Maddox where your hope ended and your fear began. "Boy," Sterling called, making the word stretch. He lifted his hat just enough to flash its silk lining. 50 cents buys a lesson in pride. I commend you for paying the full price. Men laughed again, but softer now, more watching than joining. Everett looked up just once. "I've heard a lesson's worth what a man makes of it," he said. "Some make ashes." Sterling's eyes were the color of cool iron. "Some make trouble." Everett did not answer. The crowd was already peeling apart into errands and swagger. Widow Henderson kept her gaze fixed on the empty hitching post, hands in her skirt the way a drowning woman might hide them in a dark river. She was finished with this town. Everyone knew it. Just as everyone knew that whatever had emptied her house and hardened her mouth had begun with that barn. Folk tales cling like burrs, lights at night, the hiss of something deep below. A day when Henderson himself had stopped speaking and never started again. Men had walked past the listing door and called the whole thing worthless. But men who spend their days counting other men's herd often forget how to count the small, odd angles of morning light. A week earlier, Everett had come out to the fence line while the sun was still young and mean, a roll of wire on his shoulder to excuse his presence. He had leaned at a distance, respectable enough not to draw remark. The barn sat cocked on its stones. A swallow coasted in and vanished into the throat of the loft. No wind, yet the far wall wore a thin veil of moving gold. The light slipped along the inside planks, where gaps admitted only threads, and in that slant, he'd seen what a man trained by a miner grandfather learns to see, or else wastes a life of digging holes. marks that were not age and not accident. They had order. Even from outside, through a crack no wider than a finger, he'd glimpsed the little hooks and bars and crosses, carefully cut so the grain did not split around them. Surveyor's talk, old claim code, not the familiar shorthand you daub in chalk and lose to rain, but the kind you carve where you intend truth to outlast you. He had said nothing then. He said nothing now, as he walked the one street out of town and followed the ribbon of wagon ruts toward the Henderson acreage. The key in his pocket thunked against his ribs with each step, a clock counting down to either a miracle or a humiliation you carry until you leave the county or die in it. By the time he reached the boundary stones, the day had sweated into its full heat. Grasshoppers sawed the air. The Henderson house, such as it was, just 2 rooms under a roof that had started to peel, like old paint sat empty. The door unlatched. The barn waited behind it, as if the house had been built only to distract you from what mattered. Up close, the boards were a map of all the years Henderson had been able to afford good lumber, then had not, then had made do. Cupped knots, splits mended with short nails that rust had swollen the way bullets swell in flesh. One hinge sagged in a tired arc. The lock, though, someone had kept oil on it, even while everything else dried and broke. Everett stood long enough to hear his own breath settle, then slid the key into the mouth of the iron. The turn came smooth, the way a thought does when it's been waiting to be said. Wood shifted on wood, a groan that rolled through the emptiness and seemed to return from someplace further away than the back wall. He paused, because a man raised by a careful grandfather learns the cost of not pausing, and then he heaved the door. The smell hit first. Not mold, not the sweet rot of hay gone to compost, but cool wood and old oil, the way a church smells when no one has prayed there in a long time, and the air keeps its own hymns. Sun cut the interior into coins. Dust hung inside them, unafraid to be seen. What the outside had promised, collapse and neglect, the inside refused. The floorboards, though gray with a film of years, did not give under his weight. He could hear the sound of his boots, too honest and full for a structure that looked like it should lie about every step you took. Beams rose vertical and squared, the heads of their pegs proud and clean. Someone had kept this place in defiance of the story told about it. The back wall waited in its shade. Everett crossed to it, his hands open like a man greeting a skittish animal. Up close, the cuts were plain. Notched at measured intervals, a pattern of tiny arrows leaned as if wind had taught them a single direction. Between them, a circle halved by a line, a triangle with a bite taken from one corner, a horseshoe shape with a dot set just off its heart. He did not touch them yet. He took from his jacket the little notebook he always carried, the habit of a boy who had followed old Mr. Kane between riverbeds and gulches, writing down whatever the old man muttered that sounded like a rule. He sketched the marks, faithful as a clerk, then stood back to absorb the whole. The sequence spoke if you knew its grammar. It said, "Not river." It said, "Not cistern." It said, "Something beneath. Something that runs whether men wish or no." "Throwing away your last coin on a lie," said a voice behind him. Everett did not start. He turned as if he had expected Sterling Maddox to be standing in the doorway, filling it with expensive shadow. The rancher's hat brim cut his face into day and night. His boots were too clean for a man who claimed to run cattle himself. 2 men idled a pace behind him. No need to introduce them, for they were always there in different names and the same faces. Sterling let his gaze travel the interior, and some small muscle at the corner of his jaw twitched. He had not expected this, the upright beams, the certainty of the floor. He hid the surprise well, but not from a watcher like Everett. "You could have eaten," Sterling said conversationally, Instead, you bought a barn that frightens old women. Old women frighten easy, Everett answered mildly, but not always for foolish reasons. Sterling's smile was thin. Value, Mr. Kane, is where a man like me points and says it is. The rest, he lifted a hand, as if brushing crumbs from a table, is sentiment. He drifted to the wall with the marks, performing the indifference of a man who inspects property only to confirm his own opinion of it. His fingertips hovered, then fell. He did not touch the cuts, but he let his hand hover there long enough for Everett to understand. Sterling saw more than he wished to show. Decorations, Everett said. Graffiti, Sterling corrected. Henderson's boy kept bad company. Miners, claim jumpers, men who scratch secrets they do not own into other men's wood. He turned. I will offer you $5. That is 10 times what you paid, which makes me a generous man. I dislike inefficiency. This, he indicated the barn, was a mistake made by a hungry stomach. I am willing to help you correct it. Everett looked at the key still in the lock, at the way sun and shadow shared the floor between his boots and Sterling's. He thought of a porch where his grandfather had taken a red pencil to a scrap of paper and shown him how a line drawn straight enough could find you water where no man believed any was left. He thought of the $quarter sweat right now into his palm, the other quarter the color of moonlight on a poor man's nights. I won't sell, he said softly. You cannot defend what you cannot keep, Sterling said. The softness of his tone was worse than a shout. This territory runs on respect, which is to say, on obedience to what is larger than yourself. I am larger than you, Mr. Kane. Do not dignify your mistake with stubbornness. Everett kept his gaze steady. Respect's a thing a man earns. Sterling's eyes cooled. And some men cannot afford. He adjusted his hat as if the conversation were weather, and he had enjoyed it well enough. There are places on this earth where it is wise to leave stones unturned. Henderson learned that lesson. Be sure you can afford to learn it otherwise. He stepped backward into noon, the two men parting to let him pass. The barn swallowed their footsteps and then fed them back to itself until they became part of its memory. Silence returned. Everett's breath went out. He did not realize until then that he'd been holding it. He shut the door, turned the key, and held it in his hand, until his hand understood. It was real. Then he crossed the yard and the field and the last fence before the road, not hurrying and not dragging, as a man walks when each stride carries what if, and if only together, like twins pulling at either elbow. At the edge of town, a dust devil climbed itself into the sky and vanished. He climbed the 3 steps to the single-room cabin he rented behind the smithy and struck a match. Lamplight made honest the scuffs on the table he had dragged out of someone's trash a year ago. He set down his notebook beside a book older than any he owned, his grandfather's journal, its leather furred with years, the pages crackling not with fragility but with use. On the first page his grandfather had written, in a big square hand, Maxim Kane, Surveyor, and under that, as if it were scripture, look longer than other men look. Everett opened to the middle where the old man's system lived, a language of edges and angles handed down by men who had needed to read a land the way other men read faces. He found the half-circle with the dot, the triangle with the bitten corner, the notched lines that leaned. He ran a fingertip over the graphite shapes until the paper warmed. The notes were brief as orders, not drift, pressure, keep clear, mark above, not upon. Beneath the symbols, a smaller hand. Everett's childish scrawl had once copied a question. What if the marks are inside? The answer, in his grandfather's terse reply. Then someone hid what he feared to lose. He marked the page with a strip of sacking and sat back. Through the thin wall, he could hear the smith's hammer making fire think it was music. Outside, the street changed color and scent as the day emptied from it. The key lay in a circle of lamplight, old iron catching gold. He put his thumb on it and felt the stubbornness run from it into him, the way heat runs from stove to bones. A knuckle touched the door. Soft. Twice. He opened to find Violet McCall framed by the twilight. She wore a plain dress the blue of evening, and a shawl she had mended with mercy instead of skill. Violet had a way of entering rooms as if she were apologizing to the air for displacing it, and a way of meeting your eyes that made you believe you might yet be the person you intended to be when you were young. "I heard," she said. Her smile was quick and tender, like a match in wind. Sterling hasn't stopped laughing long enough to swallow. "I suppose a man with that much to chew needs laughter to wash it down," Everett said. She stepped inside, gentle with the space. Her glance brushed the open journal and did not linger. "My father says you're either braver than anyone he knows, or a fool even he cannot advise." "What do you say?" "I say you've always seen weather before the rest of us do." She sat, folding her hands. "Do you remember last spring? You told folks to bring their laundry in and tie down their henhouse roofs. They told you the sky was blue. It hailed stones, like God had spilled his marbles." Everett looked at the journal. "There are marks in the barn," he said finally. "Not Henderson's boys' games." He told her nothing that would endanger him to a careless ear beyond the door, and enough to carry the outline of the thing that had taken hold in him. When he stopped, the room was quiet. Violet had bowed her head the way you bow it in church, when the preacher's voice has said something that entered where no one else could reach. "You found hope," she said. "I found a possibility. The kind that gets men like Sterling out of their chairs." She nodded, eyes darkening with thought. "We ought to be careful naming things. Sterling asked Father about you. He didn't like Father's answers. What did he want to know? Your people, your debts, whether you're the kind to sell for a sum you can fold into your pocket without breaking the seams." She hesitated. "Widow Henderson asked me to walk her as far as the crossroads this afternoon. She said she wanted to leave something here in case the right ears came along. She said," Violet looked down. "She said her husband didn't abandon that barn. He stopped because he was made to stop." The words dropped into Everett like stones into a deep well. He felt the ripples long after the sound of them had gone quiet. He closed the journal with 2 fingers, as if to keep the old pages from hearing and rising like a judge to deliver a verdict. "I thought as much," he said. "I was hoping I was wrong." "Then you will be careful?" The plea sat just at the edge of her voice. "I will be smart." He touched the key again. "Sometimes that looks like careful. Sometimes it looks like something else." They sat in the square glow of the lamp until the wick had burned low and the window turned from blue to black. When Violet stood, she reached out and, without looking at the table, set her hand where the key lay, as if blessing it. "Sleep," she said. "Tomorrow begins earlier for men who walk ahead." After the door closed, Everett blew out the lamp and lay on the pallet against the wall. Sleep came as if purchased on credit. He turned the hours with the same care he had turned the key, fitting, listening, easing, retreating. The night spoke in the language of a town that had learned to keep secrets, bargains made under canvas, a horse disturbed by a hand that smelled of smoke, the coined sound of a bottle against another bottle across the street, where men forgot themselves and then remembered too late. Somewhere, a coyote forgot it was a coyote and made the sound that reminded every man within hearing that things live in the dark that are not impressed by money. Near dawn, when the sky was the color of old tin and the air was only thinking of heat, Everett rose. He packed the satchel he'd inherited when his grandfather's heart had finally decided it would beat no further for this world. Compass, chain, a fold of wire, a pencil shaved to a useful stub. He brewed coffee so thin it mostly shared its smell, and drank it anyway. When he stepped into the street, the town had not yet put on its face. He walked past doorways that would be mouths by noon, past windows that would be eyes, and did not meet another soul. The Henderson Road was a ribbon of gray, damp in its center from a night that hadn't entirely deserted it. As he walked, Everett felt the old lessons rise with the sun. If you measure from what you do not trust, you earn lies. If you let other men set your stakes, you farm their ground. If you do not follow a line long enough to learn where it breaks, the break will find you later, when it costs more. He reached the boundary stones and paused as a habit. The land held its breath. He crossed to the barn in a straight line, not out of impatience, but to declare himself to whatever waited. The door accepted the key and gave back the small, satisfied sound of a well-kept bargain. Inside, the coolness settled around him like a damp handkerchief at a fevered neck. He set the satchel down and opened the journal to his sketches, then the compass to the world. He did not yet follow what the marks told him to follow, that would come, and soon. For now, he walked the perimeter, counting like a prayer. 1, 2, 3 boards between each gap in the wall, 4 nail heads to each joint, except where a hand had hurried and made a pair. He noted where the floorboard seams met and where they refused to meet. He marked with the soft pressure of a thumb the spots where the oak answered his weight, with a reply that belonged to something deeper than wood. Outside, something clinked. A shoe against a stone? Everett went still, the way a fox goes still. The sound did not come again. He forced his shoulders to uncoil and returned to the wall. His pencil touched the page and made a new note. The half-circle's dot slightly offset pressure not centered. He smiled without humor. Whoever carved those marks had known what he was doing. You only offset a dot like that when you don't want to fool with a shovel finding your work by accident. Light shifted along the floor, crawling toward the place where his boots had scuffed the dust into a small, soft moon. He reached to rub it out, old habit, leaving less of yourself than is strictly necessary, and stopped. Let it stand, he thought. A man should be allowed to see where he has begun. By mid-morning, the barn held heat like a secret it intended to keep. Everett closed the journal, gathered his tools, and stepped back into the day. The door swung shut on its own balance, and for an instant the place looked exactly as it had the day before and the week before that. A ruin with no right to anyone's attention. He set the lock and pocketed the key, feeling its teeth through the cloth as if it were an animal with a breath and a will. On his way to the road, he saw 2 riders cut across a distant pasture, men he did not know by name but recognized by posture, the easy slouch of hired hands whose worst trouble had always belonged to other people. They didn't look his way. Men often don't until you have something they want. He kept walking. Back in town, the square had become the theater it always became at noon. The awnings hummed with shade and flies, and the laughter outside the saloon had the brittle note of men telling jokes to prove a point. Everett skirted the crowd to the general store. Thomas Whitman stood inside with a ledger and a pencil, and the kind of patience that can outweight any debt. He looked up. His eyes took Everett in the way a dog takes a scent. Once, thoroughly, and for keeps. "You look like a man who picked a fight with a haystack," Thomas said, "and won, but does not trust the haystack to admit it." "I need flour," Everett said, "because a man's needs should be plain. And kerosene. And if you're of a mind to part with a length of good rope, I'll want it measured honest." Thomas fetched the sack and the tin and the coil. He set them down and rested both hands on the counter. studying Everett, as if somewhere in that face was news the county would care about by supper. "Sterling's horse knows the way to the bank without a rider," he said idly. "Today I saw him put spurs on for a walk across Main Street." "A man likes to look the part he plays," Everett said, "and sometimes to scare himself into believing he still plays it." Thomas rolled his pencil between finger and thumb. "You bought trouble for 50 cents, son." "I bought a barn." Thomas smiled with the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes the word is a map, and sometimes it is a blindfold." He leaned in, voice lowering. "If Henderson had left because of debt, he'd have left different. He'd have left in a hurry with noise in his wake. He left quiet. That's a man who backs away from something that can follow." Everett held the older man's gaze. He thought of Violet's careful voice and the way her hand had found the key without looking. If a man were inclined to set his affairs in order without advertising them, what would you advise? "I'd advise he remember that light is hard to argue with." Thomas straightened. "And witnesses?" Everett nodded. "Thank you," he said, paying in coins that left his pocket almost honest. He stepped back into the square, and the noise hit him like hot air out of a stable door. For a second, the sound swelled, clatter, laugh, shout, and resolved into Sterling's voice without effort, the way thunder resolves into storm. The rancher stood on the boardwalk with two men who made the street narrower by standing in it. He did not raise his chin to acknowledge Everett. He did not need to. His attention was a currency he did not spend where it could not purchase shame. Everett walked past. His body wanted to square itself the way a man squares himself against weather. He made it stay loose. Pride is a hinge as treacherous as any on a barn door. He kept his face plain as unpainted wood, and felt the eyes follow him. He rounded the stable and let the town slip off him like a coat he could not afford to keep wearing. By evening the heat broke its hold a little. He ate bread and beans with the gratitude of a man who knows he will eat tomorrow because he is stubborn enough to insist upon it. He set the lantern low and opened his grandfather's journal again. He drew lines through the sketch until they aligned with a memory that had smelled of sage and stone, and a summer the old man had called the mean one. He marked a measurement, then another. He wrote 3 words beneath them, in a hand he hoped would look steady in the morning. Follow at dawn. The town settled into night the way an animal settles into its hollow. Ever since the rail spur had passed them by in favor of a richer valley, the nights here belonged to those who made their wealth out of fear. Doors latched early, laughter curled tight around itself and went to bed in muffled rooms. Everett washed his plate, set it to dry, lay down. He did not dream, but something in him traveled anyway. To a back wall in a barn that was solid, where rumor said it was weak. To marks cut by a man who had believed that knowledge married to patience could outlast fire. To a door that had groaned in welcome, not warning. Sometime past midnight, a horse's iron rang twice on stone, and then kept its secrets. Everett lay listening. There is a difference between footsteps coming and footsteps going. These went. He slept again. Before the sun had collected its heat from whatever river it borrowed it from, he was up. He laced his boots with hands that had learned to tie men's work to men's hopes. He filled his canteen and knotted the rope into coils meant for pulling, not for tying a man. He took the journal and shut the door, and the click of the latch sounded like the answer a question gives when you finally asked it properly. The road waited. So did the barn. And under both, if the old marks were honest, and his grandfather's rules still held, ran something that did not care for men's laughter or their threats. Something that ran because it was its nature to run, deep and patient and stronger than any name men had put on it. The lamp burned late in Everett's cabin that night, its small flame trembling like a secret that wanted to speak. Outside, the town had gone quiet, but his mind refused rest. The old journal lay open before him, pages yellowed and creased, filled with his grandfather's handwriting. Sharp, deliberate, and coded in ways only a trained eye could read. Everett's fingers traced the symbols drawn there, matching them to the sketches he had copied from the barn wall earlier that day. Each curve and notch lined up perfectly. He leaned closer, his heart quickening. His grandfather's notes were clear now. These weren't random carvings left by idle hands. They were surveyor's marks, an encoded message passed through generations of men who knew how to read the earth's hidden veins. And this sequence, it meant water. Not a stream, not a shallow well, but something far deeper. The kind of water that rose from the earth on its own, pure and endless, a gift that could turn dust into pasture, poverty into fortune. In this land, where drought ruled men more fiercely than any sheriff, such a discovery meant power. Water rights built empires. Sterling Maddox had his, and he guarded them with the cruelty of a man who mistook fear for respect. But this, the marks in that barn, could change everything. A soft knock startled Everett. He slid the journal shut and snuffed part of the flame before answering. Violet McCall stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the cool desert wind. Her face carried the kind of concern that made even the bravest men listen. "Evening, Everett," she said softly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You never are," he said, motioning her inside. The lamplight painted her hair in gold streaks as she stepped over the threshold. She sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "The whole town's talking about you," she began. "They say you've lost your senses. My father says you're either a fool or the only man with eyes in a town full of blind ones." Everett smiled faintly. "I'll take either as a compliment." Violet's gaze drifted toward the closed journal. "You found something in that barn, didn't you?" He hesitated, studying her face. Violet was one of the few people in Harmony Ridge who had ever treated him with kindness. She had no reason to betray him, but trust in this town was a dangerous thing to give. "Let's just say I didn't waste my last 50 cents, he said at last. Her eyes flickered with curiosity, but she didn't press. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Then promise me you'll be careful. Sterling Maddox came by our place tonight. He asked Father about you, your family, your debts, everything. He pretended it was small talk, but I could see it in his face. He's suspicious. And when Sterling Maddox gets curious, someone always ends up paying for it." Everett felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. "He won't scare me off," he said quietly. Violet shook her head. "You don't understand. My father worked his land under Sterling's leases for 10 years. When people find something valuable, Sterling finds a way to take it. That's how he stayed rich, while everyone else barely eats." Everett's eyes hardened. "Then maybe it's time someone stopped letting him take whatever he wants." Her voice softened, almost breaking. "I heard something else. Before she left town, Widow Henderson asked me to deliver a message. She said her husband didn't leave that barn willingly. He was forced to stop working there." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lamplight flickered, throwing restless shadows across the walls. "Did she say by who?" Everett finally asked. Violet hesitated, then whispered. She didn't need to. The name neither of them said filled the room like smoke. Everett stood, pacing the floor. "That means he found it," he muttered. "Henderson must have discovered the same thing I did, and Sterling forced him out before he could claim it." He looked up, determination burning in his eyes. "Well, I'm not Henderson." Violet rose, her face pale with worry. "Then promise me something. Whatever you're planning, don't face him alone. You're one man. He's got half the territory in his pocket." "I don't need his men," Everett said, his tone calm but unyielding. "All I need is the truth, and proof that can't be denied." She studied him for a long moment, seeing the steel beneath his quiet voice. Finally, she nodded. "Then find your proof. But please, Everett, be careful. Courage means nothing if it gets you killed before you can use it." When she left, he stood at the window, watching her silhouette fade down the moonlit path. The weight of her warning pressed heavy on his chest, but beneath it pulsed something stronger, a resolve that no threat could extinguish. He returned to the journal, reopening it to his grandfather's symbols. His hands trembled as he found the page that matched the carvings exactly. There, next to the pattern of arrows and circles, his grandfather had written a note in the margin. "Mark this well. Where the earth breathes cold, water lives eternal." Everett exhaled slowly. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice again, low and rough like gravel. "Look longer than other men look, boy. The land hides its heart from cowards." The night wore on as he drew and redrew the barn's floor plan on scraps of paper. Every mark had meaning. Every distance mattered. Finally, he found the pattern that tied it all together, a spiral, leading inward to a single point at the barn's center. The final mark, the small offset dot, indicated depth. The treasure wasn't above ground. It was buried beneath. His pulse quickened. Tomorrow, he would dig. He packed his grandfather's surveying tools into the worn leather satchel, the compass, the measuring chains, the spade he'd reforged himself. Then he sat at the edge of his cot and stared at the dim flame of the lamp until it guttered out. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of dry earth and the distant whine of a coyote. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Sterling Maddox was likely still awake, plotting how to reclaim what he thought was his. But Everett Kane had made up his mind. He would uncover whatever secret Henderson had died protecting, and he would do it before Sterling Maddox even realized what he'd lost. When dawn began to silver the horizon, Everett tightened the strap on his satchel and stepped into the chill. The world before sunrise was quiet, suspended between threat and promise. The road stretched ahead, empty and waiting. He looked once toward town, then toward the barn, crouched against the rising light. The air tasted of dust and destiny. Whatever waited beneath those floorboards, he intended to find it. And this time, no man, no matter how rich or ruthless, would stand in his way. The morning air carried a thin chill that clung to Everett's breath as he crossed the empty field. A faint mist hung low over the dry grass, curling around his boots as he approached the crooked silhouette of the Henderson barn. The world was still too still. Even the crows that usually circled the fence posts were gone. He set down his worn leather satchel on the ground beside the door and paused. For a brief moment, he imagined the life that might have filled this land once. The sound of hooves, the low hum of cattle, the laughter of a man and his wife tending to their chores. All that remained now was silence and dust. Everett fit the iron key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a reluctant click, the sound echoing into the morning like a warning he refused to hear. The door creaked open, and the same strange coolness greeted him, a pocket of preserved air that had not changed even as years had stripped everything else bare. Inside, the barn looked exactly as it had before, but now Everett's gaze was sharper, his purpose defined. He knelt beside the far wall and traced the markings with his fingertips, confirming the measurements he'd written in his grandfather's journal the night before. Everything matched perfectly. Each line and symbol led inward, spiraling toward the barn's center. He opened the satchel, pulled out his compass, and began the careful work of aligning it with the carved symbols. The needle quivered, then held steady. Step by step, Everett followed the markings, his boots thudding softly against the wooden planks as he measured and noted each distance. Every symbol corresponded to a specific direction, north by east, then 2 paces south, then 5 more toward the heart of the barn. Hours passed in methodical silence. Dust motes drifted through shafts of morning sunlight, swirling around him as he worked. His hands were blistered, his shirt damp with sweat. But he didn't stop. He was close, he could feel it. At last, the symbols led him to the center beam that supported the barn's roof. The final mark, an offset dot carved deep into the wood pointed straight down. Everett knelt and brushed away the dirt and hay that had gathered there for decades. His knife scraped against the floorboards until he reached the hardened layer beneath. He pressed harder, the blade catching on something solid. A metallic ring answered him. Everett froze. Then, heart pounding, he began to clear the surrounding dirt with his hands. Slowly, an iron edge emerged, a square plate embedded in the floor, about 3 feet wide, rusted but intact. It bore the same carved symbols as the wall, along with one more thing, an inscription etched by hand into the metal. E. M. Henderson, 1847. God's blessing runs deep. For a moment, Everett couldn't breathe. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers across the inscription. This was no ordinary well. This was an artesian source, sealed decades ago by a man who had known exactly what he'd found. A self-flowing spring that never ran dry. In a land cursed by drought, it was worth more than gold. The air in the barn seemed to hum with life. He sat back on his heels, staring at the cover, his mind racing. He could already see the future unfolding, cattle thriving, crops reborn, families no longer slaves to Sterling Maddox's stranglehold on the county's water. For once, the land could belong to the people who worked it, not the man who ruled it through fear. But his thoughts were shattered by the sound of footsteps crunching outside, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. Everett scrambled to his feet, quickly scattering hay back over the iron plate to conceal it. The door groaned open before he could reach it. Sterling Maddox stepped inside. He wasn't alone. 2 of his ranch hands followed, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw, and another younger one whose nervous glance betrayed his unease. Sterling's polished boots thudded against the wooden floor, his spurs chiming softly in the stillness. "Well," he said, his voice calm and poisonous. "Looks like I caught you early. That's good. Mornings are when men make their biggest mistakes." Everett straightened, forcing his heartbeat to steady. "You're trespassing, Mr. Maddox." Sterling smiled, removing his gloves 1 finger at a time. Big word for a man with no property worth guarding. He gestured around with casual disdain. "I've been thinking about your little purchase, Kane. 50 cents for a pile of rotting wood. Seems a poor investment unless, of course, it isn't as worthless as it looks." "I told you before," Everett said evenly. "Some things are worth more than they appear." Sterling's eyes glinted with a cruel amusement. "You remind me of Henderson. He said something similar once, right before he disappeared." The ranch hands chuckled darkly. Everett's stomach twisted, but he didn't let the fear show. "Maybe you should be more careful with your comparisons, Mr. Maddox," he said quietly. "Some ghosts don't stay buried forever." Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He stepped closer, his boots leaving small, deliberate prints in the dust. "You found something here, didn't you?" he said. "Something Henderson was foolish enough to hide." He ran a gloved hand along the same wall Everett had studied. "These markings, they're not just scratches. I've seen them before. I know what they mean." Everett kept his expression neutral, though his pulse thundered. "Old decorations, that's all." "Don't insult my intelligence," Sterling snapped, his charm slipping away. He turned to his men. "You see, boys, this young man thinks he's stumbled upon a secret. Maybe he believes he's owed something for all the years the world ignored him. Maybe he's even convinced himself he can stand up to me. He looked back at Everett, his voice dropping to a hiss. But this land, this town, it all runs through me. And when someone digs where they shouldn't, they find more than dirt. The larger of the two ranch hands stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. Everett stood his ground. "I'll give you one chance," Sterling said. "Sell me this land $5, cash, 10 times what you paid. Be smart, Kane." Everett's reply came slow and measured. "If you're offering 10 times the price, then maybe you're the fool who undervalues it." The younger ranch hand smirked until Sterling shot him a glare. The older man's hand moved toward the revolver at his hip. "I said I'm not interested," Everett added, his voice steadier now. Sterling's face darkened, and for the first time, the mask of charm fell away completely. "You don't seem to understand," he said softly. "This territory isn't kind to men who forget their place. Accidents happen. Barns catch fire. Graves get dug for men who wander off looking for work." Everett's jaw tightened. "Is that what happened to Mr. Henderson? An accident?" The silence that followed was deafening. For an instant, something flickered in Sterling's eyes. Guilt, or maybe the memory of a secret buried too long. Then it vanished, replaced by cold fury. "Henderson was a weak man," Sterling said sharply. "He refused my partnership. I offered him protection, and he turned it down. He thought the law would protect him instead. The law doesn't run this land, I do." Now Everett knew the truth. Sterling hadn't just known about the well, he had tried to take it by force, and when Henderson refused, he'd driven him off, maybe worse. Everett took a slow step forward. "Then let me be clear, Mr. Maddox. I'm not Henderson. And you don't own me, this land, or what's beneath it." The air between them crackled with tension. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sterling exhaled sharply, pulling his gloves back on. "You've made your choice," he said finally. "Remember that, when the consequences find you." He turned toward the door, his men following. The younger one glanced back just once, with something that looked like unease, maybe even pity. When the door shut, the barn fell silent again. Everett's knees nearly gave way as he sank to the floor. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. He looked toward the hidden iron plate beneath the hay, the secret that had nearly cost Henderson his life and might soon cost him his own. But fear wasn't what filled him now. It was resolve. Sterling's threats had only confirmed what Everett already knew. There was something here worth protecting. Something powerful enough to make a man like Sterling desperate. And that meant Everett Kane could not turn back. He brushed the hay away one last time and placed his hand on the cool iron cover. "You died protecting this, Henderson," he whispered. "I'll finish what you started." Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying the scent of storm clouds gathering in the distance. The fight for the land had begun. The night settled heavy over the town of Harmony Ridge, the kind of darkness that felt deliberate-like. The land itself was holding its breath. In his small cabin, Everett Kane sat by the window, his rifle resting across his lap, the lamplight throwing long, restless shadows across the floor. Every creak of the boards outside made his pulse quicken. Every gust of wind against the glass sounded like boots in the dirt. He hadn't slept since Sterling Maddox's visit. The man's words, "Accidents happen. Barns catch fire," kept replaying in his mind, looping through the silence until it became something heavier than fear. Certainty. He rose and paced, the wooden floor groaning under his weight. He couldn't just wait for trouble to come. Sterling wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. He was the kind who erased obstacles. As the first gray light of dawn crept into the room, Everett strapped on his worn leather belt, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and headed toward town. The streets were still quiet when he reached the general store, where Thomas Whitman was just unlocking the door. The old merchant looked up, surprise flickering in his weathered eyes. "You look like a man who's seen the end of the world," he said, pushing the door open. "Come inside before the whole town sees that look on your face." Everett stepped in, the familiar smell of dust, flour, and kerosene grounding him. "Thomas, I need help," he said bluntly. "And witnesses, people who can't be bought." Thomas's brows rose. "Sterling again?" Everett nodded. "He knows about the barn, about what's under it. He tried to buy me out. And when that didn't work, he made it clear he'd rather burn it to the ground than let me keep it." Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Always knew that man's greed would come to fire one day. Henderson tried standing up to him once. Didn't end well." "That's why I need proof," Everett said, lowering his voice. "The carvings, the iron plate, they're all there. If I can get someone from the Territorial Land Office to see it, to mark it official, Sterling can't touch it." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "There's a surveyor Collins. Good man. Works for the territory. He's due through town next week. If he documents what you found, even Sterling can't dispute it." "But," Everett frowned. "But what?" Thomas's gaze darkened. "That barn won't last a week if Maddox knows what's buried under it." The words had barely left his mouth when a distant commotion rose from the street outside. Hoofbeats, shouts, the unmistakable clatter of men in a hurry. Thomas crossed to the window and looked out. "Speak of the devil," he muttered grimly. "He's not waiting a week. He's moving now." Everett stepped beside him and saw them, Sterling Maddox and 6 of his ranch hands, riding hard through the town square, heading straight for the Henderson property. Torches flickered in their hands, trailing smoke that smeared the morning light. For a heartbeat, Everett couldn't move. Then everything inside him caught fire. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted for the door. "I have to stop them!" "Everett!" Thomas shouted, catching his arm. "You go alone! You'll die alone!" Everett shook him off. "Then I'll die with my land." He mounted his horse and kicked hard, the animal leaping into motion. The wind tore at his face as he rode through the dusty road, his eyes fixed on the rising plume of smoke ahead. The closer he got, the stronger the acrid scent of burning wood filled the air. When he crested the final hill, his worst fear unfolded before him. The barn was already ablaze. Flames licked up the walls, feeding on the dry timber, crackling like laughter in the morning wind. Sterling Maddox stood a few yards away, his gloved hands resting casually on his saddle, his face illuminated by the fire's orange glow. "Terrible shame," he called out when he saw Everett approaching. "These old structures, so easy to catch fire. Lucky thing no one was inside." Everett jumped off his horse, fury surging through him. "You bastard. That's my land." Sterling's men turned toward him, their revolvers gleaming in the light. 6 against 1. Everett raised his rifle but knew the math wasn't in his favor. Still, he didn't lower it. "This is arson," he said through clenched teeth. "And every man here is a witness." Sterling's smile widened. "And who's going to believe you, Kane? A penniless fool with 50-cent property? Or me, the man who feeds half this town?" He gestured toward the barn as the flames climbed higher, the roof starting to collapse with a thunderous groan. "There. Now we're even. You lost nothing but a pile of wood." But even as he spoke, a sound began to rise beneath the roar of the fire, a deep, muffled rumble from below. The ground trembled. The horses reared, neighing in panic. Then, with a sudden explosion of steam and light, the earth split open at the barn's center. A jet of crystal-clear water burst through the floor, shooting 20 feet into the air. The flames hissed and died under the torrent. Steam filled the air, and the fire's glow was replaced by the dazzling brilliance of sunlight, reflecting off rushing water. An audible gasp swept through the men. The iron plate that had sealed the well for decades had given way under the heat, releasing what had been hidden for generations, the artesian spring, still alive, still powerful. Everett lowered his rifle slowly, awe and vindication mingling in his chest. "Looks like God had other plans, Sterling," he said quietly. "Justice runs deeper than greed." Sterling's face went pale. "Impossible," he whispered. But the proof was right before him, the barn reduced to ashes, the well bursting with life, the dry earth around it turning dark and rich with moisture. From the road below, riders began to appear, townsfolk drawn by the smoke, now staring wide-eyed at the miracle unfolding before them. Thomas Whitman arrived moments later, waving a bundle of papers. "I've got the land records," he shouted. "Everett Kane is the legal owner of this property, and everything on it, including water rights. I'll swear it before the territorial court." The crowd murmured, turning toward Sterling with growing hostility. His men shifted uneasily, lowering their weapons. Then another voice cut through the chaos, a steady, authoritative tone. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Whitman. I saw it myself." A man stepped forward from the gathering crowd, dusting off his long coat. He was tall, gray-haired, and carried a brass compass at his belt. "Name's Collins," he said. "Territorial surveyor. I was passing through earlier than expected. This is a registered artesian source. By law, the water rights belong to the property owner, regardless of purchase price." Sterling's composure shattered. "You can't do this," he barked. "The boy bought a worthless barn for 50 cents. This isn't—" "Law doesn't care about what you think is worthless," Collins interrupted firmly. "Only what's proven." He turned to Everett. "Congratulations, Mr. Kane. This discovery will change the territory." The crowd erupted in cheers. People clapped Everett on the back, shouting words of support. Others glared at Sterling, their years of quiet resentment breaking into open defiance. Violet McCall pushed through the throng, breathless, her eyes wide with disbelief and pride. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Everett smiled faintly, the sound of rushing water filling the air like a hymn. "We did it, Violet. All of us. This land doesn't belong to one man anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever fought to live on it." Sterling Maddox stood frozen, surrounded by his men, stripped of his power. His empire of fear had drowned in the very water he tried to destroy. As the sun climbed higher, the people of Harmony Ridge gathered around the newly born spring, watching the clear stream carve its way through the parched soil, spreading outward like hope itself. For the first time in living memory, the land breathed again. And Everett Kane, the man who'd spent his last 50 cents on a forgotten barn, had become the one who restored life to an entire town. 6 months later, the hills of Harmony Ridge no longer shimmered with dust, they shone with life. Where cracked soil once stretched barren and gray, lush pastures rolled out in every direction, their grass thick and green as emerald silk. The air carried the sweet scent of new crops, and the rhythmic murmur of running water had become the pulse of a land reborn. Everett Kane stood at the edge of his porch, hat in hand, watching as sunlight played across the irrigation channels that spread like veins through the valley. The artesian well, the same one that Sterling Maddox had tried to destroy, now fed more than just his ranch. It nourished every small farm for miles around. Children splashed at the shallow pools where the overflow gathered. Their laughter carried over the fields, echoing like music between the ridges. Cattle grazed contentedly, and the crops grew so quickly it seemed the earth itself was racing to make up for lost time. Everett leaned against the porch post, his calloused hands resting easily against the wood. He still wore the same jacket he'd worn the day he bought that worthless barn. though it now hung a little looserless from hunger, more from hard-earned peace. Behind him, the door creaked open. Violet McCall stepped out, holding an envelope stamped with an official territorial seal. "The governor's reply," she said, handing it to him with a smile. "I think you'll like it." Everett took the letter carefully, breaking the wax seal and unfolding the parchment. His eyes moved slowly over the elegant handwriting. Then, as the words settled in, a quiet smile spread across his face. "They approved it," he said softly. "The water cooperative. It's official." Violet's smile widened. "So it's done then. No one man will ever own the water again." He nodded, his voice steady but full of quiet wonder. "Every rancher, every farmer, every family gets a fair share. No more buying life from a man with a ledger." She leaned on the railing beside him, her gaze following the silver threads of water glinting in the sun. "Henderson would be proud," she said. "He started something he never got to finish, and you made sure no one could ever bury it again." Everett's gaze drifted toward the field where the barn once stood. The land there was clean, now leveled, fertile and rich. A small wooden marker stood in its place, bearing a single inscription. E.M. Henderson, 1847. God's blessing runs deep. "The barn's gone," Everett said quietly, "but its purpose remains." Violet looked at him, her expression soft. "You ever think about how close you came to losing it all?" "Every day," he admitted. "If that fire hadn't broken the seal, if that well hadn't burst open when it did, none of this would exist." He paused, then added, "Funny thing, isn't it? Sterling tried to destroy it, and instead, he revealed it to the world." Violet smiled gently. "Sometimes greed digs the hole where justice is buried." He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's one way to put it." They watched in silence for a moment as the wind rippled through the tall grass. Across the field, a group of ranchers worked together repairing a fence, their laughter drifting on the breeze. Men who once glared at each other across property lines now labored side by side. Harmony Ridge had finally earned its name. Sterling Maddox was long gone. After the fire, after the crowd's anger and the surveyor's testimony, his empire had crumbled. Charged with arson and attempted theft, he'd fled the territory, leaving his lands to be divided among the very people he'd oppressed. No one had seen him since. Some said he'd crossed into Arizona. Others swore he'd died alone in the desert. No one much cared to find out. Everett folded the governor's letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "It's strange," he said. "When I bought that barn, I thought I was buying my last chance. Turns out, I was buying everyone's first." Violet reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "You didn't just find water, Everett. You found courage when everyone else had lost theirs." He met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in like rain into dry soil. "Maybe that's the real treasure Henderson left behind," he said quietly. Just the reminder that doing what's right can still change something." The sun began to sink, spilling gold across the valley. The water shimmered like molten light as it wound its way through the land, carrying the reflection of the sky across every field it touched. Everett and Violet sat together on the steps, the quiet hum of life filling the space between them. The wind carried the laughter of children, the lowing of cattle, and the rustle of green leaves that had no business growing this fast in a place once cursed by drought. "Do you ever think about Sterling?" Violet asked after a long silence. "Sometimes," Everett admitted, "but not with anger anymore. If not for him, I might never have found the courage to dig." She smiled. "Maybe that's the real blessing. He forced you to become the man you were meant to be." Everett chuckled softly. "Maybe so." They sat until the stars began to bloom overhead, reflected faintly in the still pools of water that glimmered like mirrors in the fields below. The land was alive again. and for the first time, so was hope. Everett Kane, the man who'd spent his last 50 cents on a forgotten barn, had given life back to an entire territory. He'd turned mockery into legacy, ruin into renewal. The water whispered through the channels as night settled fully, a steady, eternal sound that seemed to speak the truth of the land itself. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones you find, they're the ones you share. He spent his last 50 cents and gave life to an entire town. The true treasure wasn't underground, it was in his heart. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think about Everett's courage.